the next chapter, chapter 25. This is a chapter that continues to look at different types of markets. So we started with perfect competition, the extreme case where all the products are exactly the same and all the firms are selling a profit, selling goods at a zero economic profit in the long run, et cetera, et cetera. And we moved all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is monopoly, which is where there is only one business. And if you think about it, those things do exist. There is perfect competition, all right? There is monopoly. At the extremes, these two things do exist. But most of what actually happens in the real world is the gray area in between. And that's what this chapter discusses, is more of the gray area. Monopolistic competition and oligopoly are your third and fourth types of markets that we're going to talk about in this class. So let's jump into it. We'll start with monopolistic competition. And then we'll think about some examples in the real world of monopolistic competition. So there are some criteria that need to be met. When we talk about perfect competition, homogeneous product, free entry and exit, etc. Monopoly, you need to just have one business, and probably there's some barriers to entry in the markets. For monopolistic competition, this is what you'll expect to see. The first is that there are many buyers and sellers. So like perfect competition, there are lots of producers and lots of consumers of these goods. But the big dividing line here is compared to perfect competition. The producers are selling slightly differentiated products. So the products are not exactly the same. So it's not like selling oil or selling soy. It's not like selling stock. All of those things would be perfect competition. In monopolistic competition, you're selling something that's a little bit different. And again, we'll get to some examples of this in the future. Just one more characteristic, and that is easy entry and exit. Easy but not necessarily free entry and exit, so there may be some small barriers, but not barriers that are so significant that it stops a willing producer from entering the market. Okay? So really it's like perfect competition in a lot of ways, but the big difference is they're selling something that's a little bit different. Okay? So let me give you some examples here. Right off the bat, here's a good one, restaurants. If you think about restaurants, they fit all of these characteristics. There are many buyers and sellers, so there are many people who consume at restaurants, and there are many restaurants that exist that are selling the products. Slightly differentiated products. If you walk into a restaurant, there's going to be a lot that's similar to another restaurant, but slightly different. So they may serve water, they may serve beer, they may serve wine, they may serve salads, but there's probably going to be some things that are slightly different about it. In regards to its marketing, it may be slightly different. In regards to the layout of the restaurant or the clientele that they're trying to attract, or the food quality and style of food, these things may all be slightly differentiated. Okay? So there are still many buyers and sellers, but they're selling things that are a bit different. Gas stations, especially true in a big city. Many different gas stations, they're selling similar products, but they're all just a little bit different in terms of what they offer. And just one more here, clothing. And in fact, if you think about it, there's a lot of different industries that fit these three criteria that we just discussed. So as it turned out, monopolistic competition is the most common type of market that there is. And so it's important that we understand it. That being said, we kind of already have a lot of the tools that we need to discuss this. So we're going to keep this relatively brief. All right, so let's think about an example, a specific example. The one that came to mind to me is, I like to talk about beer because to me beer is a really interesting market because there's so many different producers. The laws get really complicated. And so I came up with a monopolistic competition example that I think really matches a lot of the characteristics of monopolistic competition perfectly. Lots of people buy beer, and there are tons of different breweries, okay? The difference in the products is small. They all use water and barley and malt and hops. They're all producing very similar products, but they're all slightly differentiated. And if you've had beer, if you drank beer before, you know that they're all just a little bit different. In some cases, they're extremely different. Different styles of beer can be very different, but they're still producing products that are quite similar. They're selling them usually in cans or glass bottles, usually 12 ounces, sometimes 22, sometimes 24. Just a little bit different from producer to producer. And that's what you see with monopolistic competition, slightly differentiated products. So if you think about what they try to do here, let's think about what's going on in the short run versus the long run. And this will really help you understand the goals or motivation that perfectly competitive or monopolistically competitive firms face. So in the short run, Sweetwater can certainly earn positive or negative economic profits. They can do well or they can do poorly. This will be partially in their control and partially out of their control. Kind of like we saw with perfect competition. What I mean by that is there's things that Sweetwater can do to help themselves, but they're still also kind of at the mercy of the market. This is different from perfectly competitive firms. If you're a soy producer, you're almost completely at the whims of the market. You don't really have any control over what happens. But when it comes to these firms, they do make choices, and these choices are really important. So in the short run, they could do well, or maybe they don't do so well. Maybe they do well because they have a really good marketing campaign in the short run. All right? That would be something they control themselves. Maybe they do poorly in the short run because they have poor quality control. Again, that's something they control. But there's also things that can happen in the market. If we find out that alcohol is really bad for you, if we find out that alcohol causes people to get the coronavirus, well then obviously that's going to hurt them, and there's nothing that they can really do to control that. There's nothing they can do to stop that. So it's partially in their control. In the long run, and this is where things get pretty interesting, in the long run, it's kind of tough to know what would happen to a monopolistically competitive firm. And in the book, they give a good explanation of their thoughts on this. I'm going to try to condense those and sort of give my own logic to this. In the long run, if the firm doesn't evolve, others will simply copy their product. And think about that. If you're Sweetwater Brewery and you have your beers that you produce, they got 420 and Sweetwater IPA and so forth. If you're Sweetwater, other firms can basically just copy you. If you're somebody who is doing very well, if Sweetwater is making really big economic profits, other firms can just copy you, and eventually it just feels like there's a bunch of firms out there that are the same. What would we call that if there's a bunch of firms producing products that are the same? It would basically shift into perfectly competitive markets. So the market becomes perfectly competitive. Now that's an extreme case, but you can imagine that being possible. All right. In the United States, we have some laws that, as you probably know, that would make that impossible. Other breweries can't come out and just make a beer called, Sweetwater 420. There are copyright laws and patent laws and so forth. All right, so those will discourage the market shifting towards perfectly competitive characteristics. But nonetheless, think about what this means. All right, in the long run, if the firm doesn't evolve, they could be left with a perfectly competitive market. So what is the goal then? The goal is to constantly evolve. So to gain or maintain some market power. When I say market power, I mean the ability to control the price, the ability to have special control over the market. So to maintain some market power, firms such as Sweetwater will need to evolve and innovate. All right? And that right there is a key thing to recognize. It shows you what these firms need to do, and it also will give you a hint about what types of markets are out there. If you see a market where the firms are constantly changing their products, if they're constantly evolving, chances are that is a monopolistically competitive market, because this type of characteristic is what you'll expect to see the outcome of for successful companies. They will need to adapt. Okay? So if I'm starting a brewery and I see that Sweetwater is successful, what I would do is try to copy them. And so Sweetwater, what they're going to do is basically stay one step ahead of me. They're going to be constantly evolving. So that means putting out new marketing campaigns, releasing new beers, opening up new tap rooms, etc., etc. Doing things so that I can't copy them, staying one step ahead so that they always seem unique. Okay? If they're able to do this, then it is possible to earn positive economic profits. But that is no guarantee, and that is really quite a challenge for a firm to endure. They've got to figure out a way to do this. It's not always going to be easy. Okay? So in the book, they basically discuss this, and they say usually profits will move towards zero economic profit, and again, in order to avoid that, these firms are going to have to try to evolve. So to go back on some of those examples that we talked about before, think about restaurants. Restaurants are always changing. Think about fast food restaurants. They look so much different than they did 5 years ago. Their menus slowly change over time. Their pricing selections, their marketing choices, all of these things evolve over time. And that is because they're trying to stay monopolistically competitive. If they just stop innovating and just stay the same, firms will copy them, enter the market, drive down prices until economic profits go to zero. Okay? So that's monopolistic competition in terms of the discussion. Let's think about what it looks like graphically. So graphically, this is what we think it looks like. In a monopolistically competitive firm or market, businesses are selling products that are slightly different. So what that means is they have some market power. So what we'll see here is they are price searchers, just like monopolies. Because you're selling something a little bit different, you have some control over the price. So demand is downward sloping. Marginal revenue is twice as steep. Marginal cost is upward sloping. It's the same thing as with monopolies. Okay, so graphically there's nothing new to discuss here. Here's the quantity the firm would choose. Here's their price, right? We could figure out their producer surplus and profits and everything else we needed to, but that's something that we've done in the past. Okay? So what this basically tells us is if they maintain their monopolistically competitive environment, this graph is appropriate. Right? And this is the one we're going to be using on the quiz and exam and everything. However, what do you think will happen if they fail to innovate, if they fail to evolve? Well, then the market is going to shift. If they fail to innovate, well, then eventually the market just becomes perfectly competitive, and you can find 100 different breweries producing a beer that's very similar to Sweetwater. So without evolving, the market might become perfectly competitive. Assuming it's able to meet the other qualifications of perfect competition. Okay, so in the short run, profits can be positive because they're in a monopolistically competitive environment. They could be negative just because maybe they're producing an inferior product, maybe there's not enough demand. So profits can be positive or negative. In the long run, they will be zero if this occurs, okay? But they can still maintain and be positive if the firm is able to innovate and stay ahead of the curve. So that is the logic of monopolistic competition, and that is why you see so many firms constantly adjusting a lot of their strategies over time, marketing, products, etc.